All right, so we're going to be talking about HTML and CSS. I really enjoy, this week because I like creating things that users can interact with, stuff you can see, stuff you can kind of design. I know early on in my career, when I was learning, programming, I was like, well, this isn't really that cool, right? We're writing terminal-based applications. There isn't anything cool to look at or visual to develop. And I was like, well, is this, this what programming is? Like, I thought I'd be developing like, cool applications on Windows or whatever it might be. And yeah, again, I was kind of like, I was unprepared for what I was expecting. So, understandable the past 3 weeks, we're kind of creating algorithms, small scale problems and trying to just get the logic down. Now we're actually going to add some UI where users can interact with our application. That's where HTML comes into play. So let's actually talk about HTML first. So the three items we're going to be covering this week are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So let's actually talk about what these languages offer, and then hopefully you can understand why we're piecing all of them together. So first we have HTML. So I'm going to create a small analogy here. Hopefully it kind of makes sense. But for HTML, I'm going to kind of describe that as our structure. So this is what gives structure to our web pages. And the analogy I'll go with here is that HTML is basically our skeleton, right? Or the bones of our application. So the front end needs some structure, and that's what HTML kind of gives it. All right, so HTML will be our bones for a manner of speaking. And then we have the browser. So this is not something that we need to develop. Obviously, we use Firefox, Safari, whatever modern browser you're using should get the job done. But the browser is actually what takes your structure or takes your HTML document and actually renders it. So when you're rendering, a skeleton, you'll like put some skin on it. So you actually have something visual to present. So in this case, the body or the outer, skin kind of wraps your skeleton and gives it something more defined, something visual that we can look at. All right, so again, the browser is not something we need to code, but it's something that we definitely use to render our HTML documents. Next up, we have CSS. So CSS, given our structure and body, that's fine. Like that gives enough for us to create a web page, but that usually isn't what we just want. So CSS, where we get the look and layout, right? So we actually want to dress up our web page. So instead of just using HTML, we use CSS to give ourselves some style. In this case, in my analogy, CSS would be the clothing or like, the accessories we add on to our body so that, it looks kind of cool and something that's more, visually appealing. All right, so that's the role of CSS, to actually design our web page. And then finally, we have JavaScript. So JavaScript is actually the logic that we give our web page. So these three components, HTML, CSS, and I guess our browser rendering, those two components, that gives us a web page, something that we can look at and interact with. There's not much that that it can do. It's actually just a dumb web page at that point, where users can read stuff. We render content. That's the gist of what HTML and CSS can accomplish for us. JavaScript is actually the brains of our operation. That's where we go from having like kind of a dumb web page. When I say dumb web pages, mean something that doesn't really do much. It just presents content. JavaScript gives you more interactivity, gives you more capability with your web page, so that you can actually process input. You can actually do calculations. Do cool things rather than just showing content on your web page. All right, so today we're going to be covering HTML and CSS. JavaScript will enter the equation later on this week, but let's actually just make sure we understand, how HTML works, how it's structured, and how we develop an HTML web page. I know some of us may have dabbled with HTML in the past. The web's been around for a good, 2-3 decades. So I definitely kind of tinkered with HTML, just creating some web pages like with a simple text editor. But the tools we have today and the capabilities of HTML are much more advanced. So let's actually get into HTML. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. One thing I want to make clear is that HTML isn't technically a programming language. You're not really creating, logical flow. You're not making decisions. You're just creating a structure. So again, for that reason, it's not really a programming language, but it does tie in well to some of the concepts that we've gone over. So what is HTML used for? So simply, HTML is used to create web pages. More specifically, it gives structure to a web page. So another analogy I'm just going to throw in here is think about, let's say we're building a house. In that case, HTML would be the the foundation, like the pillars, the walls that you put up inside of your house. Again, nothing has nothing to do with styling. It's just basically creating the framework or the structure for your house. And as mentioned, we'll create HTML documents, and then web browsers will actually take in that structure and process them. So it'll actually, I'd say HTML might be more like the blueprints, and then the browser actually is like you building up that structure. So, Chrome, Firefox, whatever your favorite web browser is, will process HTML documents and render them to the screen. So, this is going to be kind of a boring slide, but it's always good to have the terminology down. So we're going to be, talking about HTML, and there's specific terminology that we're going to need to know. So make sure you kind of understand when someone refers to elements or tags, you know what that means. So first, at the top level, we have an HTML document. That consists of HTML elements. Often these will be nested, and we'll see some examples of this, but elements are basically what comprises an HTML document. An element can further be broken down into a tag and some content. Not always, some tags do not need content. We'll see examples of those, but again, just understand that an element is consisted of tags and content. A tag further can be broken down into have additional attributes, and attributes are basically name value pairs where you have an attribute name and then the value for the attribute. So I've highlighted the key terminology that hopefully you will be comfortable with as we use it more, but just know elements, tag, content, attributes, name, and value. Those are going to be used often. So just kind of pay attention to those when we talk about them. And again, if you have any questions, let me know. All right, so again, terminology, let's actually see some examples because it's better to actually apply them to some HTML. So here's an example of syntax of an element. So here you'll get a tag name. Some things to point out here. When you're creating an element, you use an opening angle bracket. So this opening caret or angle bracket, then there's a tag name. Tags may have attributes. You don't always need to include those attributes. So, in this case, there's 2 attributes and then some content, and then you have a closing tag typically to kind of tie up that element. So this example down here, we have Href, we have Platoon.org, some text here, and then a tag here. So let's break this down. So this entire thing is one element, all right? So this entire line, one element, let's break it down further to kind of go over the other pieces. So here, this entire green block is the opening tags. Everything between the opening angle bracket and the closing angle bracket, or the whatever the less than and then greater than brackets, this is entirely is one tag. That's the opening tag. Every opening tag needs a closing tag. So that's what we have at the very end. So the key thing to notice here, the name of the tag for this example is A, also known as the anchor tag, but short form is A. So the tag name is A. The way to close a tag is with you have an opening angle bracket, / and the tag name again. So notice the tag name here is A. That's why we have an A over here. Then we close that closing tag with angle bracket. All right, so these are tags. Again, you want an opening and closing tag to kind of have that, not namespace, but basically the extent of this element will be the opening and closing tag. In the middle, you'll have the content of that tag. So as I mentioned, not every tag will have content, but in this case, we're creating a link. So we're actually going to create a link to www.codeplatoon.org, and the user will see the content. The user is not going to see anything within these tags. These tags are just for your browser to know how to render this content. So, we've navigated through web pages. We've seen links. Anytime you see like something that underlines, if we can go to a web page, like right here, like this would be an example of a link where, you see it's going to take you somewhere. The cursor kind of changes. Again, this is your browser interpreting this content and knowing that this is an anchor tag. So if I click on it, it'll take me somewhere. In this case, it's going to take us to the Papa curriculum calendar. Yeah, so again, just know that an element is consisted of tags where you have an opening and closing tag, and then in between you'll have the content. And that's what the user will actually see. Let's break down our tag a little more in detail. So again, we mentioned each tag will have a tag name, and we'll get familiar with some of the more common ones. Just know there's a lot of them to kind of know. So we have a tag name, and then we have an attribute. So in this case, this attribute, it has a name and value pair. So in this case, the attribute is href, and the value for it is www.platoon.org. So that's what we have. We have the attribute name and the attribute value. Any questions about just the basic structure of an HTML element? All right. So again, yeah, just get familiar with the terminology, know what a tag is, know the difference between a tag and an element, know how attributes are kind of structured. So again, you have an attribute name, equal sign, and then the attribute value. Okay, cool.
Is the value always enclosed in quotes regardless of its type or not type?
Yes, excellent question. Yes, you're gonna always, you're gonna have your values always gonna be in quotes. When we get into like JavaScript and React, that might change a little bit, but yeah, you're gonna always have quotes for your values. I'm trying to think if there's any exceptions to that. Okay, let's talk more about elements. So again, there's just like different classes, or maybe class is the wrong word, but different types of elements or subtypes. So when we're talking about elements, they can be broken down into block level elements or inline elements. And again, we'll see a better example of this, but just know that some elements are just block level, some are inline. How do you know? Well, there's no great way of saying this, but it's just memorization. But you're not going to necessarily have to memorize everything. That's what references are for. That's what reading documentation is for. But just know that some elements will be block level and some will be inline. Now, what is a block level element? So if you think of a web page, just looking at a screen, a block level elements will take up the entire horizontal space. So for example, the paragraph tag, H1 tag, a div tag, that basically means that anything for that line is going to be consumed by this entire tag. You can't share, like you can't have two paragraphs on the same horizontal line because each paragraph wants its own line. All right, so block level elements take up an entire horizontal space. The opposite of that are inline elements. So elements may share the same horizontal space with other inline elements. So for example, anchor tags, you could have multiple links on the same line. I'm not sure if our curriculum page has that, but again, I'm sure you guys have seen multiple, I could have a link here, which I do, and like this could be another link also. They can share the same line. They could be, again, this is a paragraph. We can have inline elements within a paragraph because they can kind of be nested within block level elements. So yeah, the anchor tag, there's other like formatting, like strong is the equivalent of bold on web pages. There's also something called span, but just know that some elements might be block level, some might be inline. They are good to know. The more you use them, you'll kind of understand which ones kind of work which way. There's also the concept of non-empty and empty elements. So examples of non-empty elements, paragraph tag, anchor tag, there's also a list tag. These have content. So when we talk about content, we have tags, we have the opening tag, closing tag, in between you have content. That's what non-empty elements are. They're just elements that have content to display to the user. Empty tags, empty elements are tags that have no content associated with them. So in this case, like the image tag, you will specify an image to show, but there's no content that goes in between the tags. So we go back to our example here. So here we have content, but not every tag needs content, meaning that you won't have an opening and closing tag and stuff in between. That's all that just means empty tags don't have content associated with them. So we go back, if I can get through this. So again, we have image, there's also break line, horizontal roll. We'll talk more about these. But in this case, we have an image tag that shows a donuts.png file. But notice at the very end, we have a / and angle bracket. This is an example of both an opening and closing tag all in one line. Again, these aren't separated out. This is self-closing because there's no content that needs to go between the opening and closing tag. So you can do it this way. And you'll see this often for empty elements. All right, so again, this is still closing the tag. It's just kind of done all together because there's no content we need to insert between them. All right, So we're going to be talking about some common tags you'll encounter. Just know, as I mentioned, there's probably hundreds of HTML tags. You're not going to need to know all of them or memorize them. We're going to go over the most common ones, but just know that there's a lot more to learn out there. So common required tags. So there's HTML. This is what actually starts your HTML document. When we look at the document, HTML document, you're going to see it's going to be nested. So HTML is going to be your most outer tag or element that you're going to deal with. Within your HTML tag, you're going to nest additional tags. So you're going to have usually going to have a head section and a body section. So again, if you go back to the example, like you might have your skull, which is your head, and then the rest of the body would be contained in the body section. Within your head section, you usually will see a title element, and this actually is what your web page will use to show a title within your tab. We'll see an example of this shortly, I promise. And then these are common tags you'll be using within your web page. As I mentioned, there's hundreds of them, but the ones I've listed here are probably the most, the 10 or so, whatever most common ones you'll run into. So let's kind of talk about them high level, and then I promise we'll get to an example because a lot of this probably doesn't make sense at this point. So you'll see header tags, and there's 6 different types. There's H1 all the way to H6. And these are used for kind of just, as you would guess, for headings, like titles of your pages. H1 will be your largest, and this is just kind of like a formatting option. So H1 will make your text larger and bolder, and this is what you would expect when you see titles. So if I go to the web page, let's go to espn.com. So if I look at this page, once it loads, if it does load. All right, so this would likely be a header right here, because that's like a slightly larger title. It's bolder, also happens to be a link. You see some contrasting, fonts and formatting. But yeah, so again, you'll see headers like top headlines. That's probably at H6. So H1 is your largest heading. H6 is your smallest, as in your smallest font. But so I bet this top headline is probably like an H6 heading. Yeah. Okay, so that's what headers are used for. Then you have text. So normally when you have text, you're going to use the paragraph tag. That's the P tag that you see here. So any normal content, if you go back to our ESPN page, like this right here will be a paragraph tag. Let's click on a, so all these are in paragraph tags. I don't want this video to play, so I'll pause it. But we have a heading here, so this would be a header, probably like an H2. Again, just looking at the size, so H1 is your largest, H2 will be slightly smaller, H3 will be smaller than that, and so forth. Then you have most of your text will be wrapped in paragraph tags. So all this would be within P tags if we look behind the scenes. Then you can also create links. So we talked about that. That's the A tag, also known as the anchor tag. This is how you actually create navigational links within your page or to other pages. Also inserting images, the IMG tag is how you insert images into your web page. You can also create lists, so just another way to format your content or your text. You could create ordered lists, that's what OL stands for. Unordered lists, which is what UL stands for. And then within those lists, you can have list items. That's what LI is. So you might have ordered lists or unordered lists. Both of them will use LI to create list items within them. For spacing, we have BR, which stands for break line. This is the same thing as the new line character when we're coding in Python or JavaScript. We need a new line in our text. BR, or the break line tag, is the one we want to use to create a new vertical break. HR, it stands for horizontal rule. This is kind of just like a dividing line that you could add to your web pages. It just divides, it's a line that takes up the entire horizontal space. It's a block level element, but that's what HR stands for. And then you can create sections within your page. So the two most common ones are div and span. The only difference between div and span, if you remember a couple slides ago, div is a block level element. So anything that's within a div, that's going to be by default block level, versus span is inline, meaning you can create multiple spans on the same line. You can use them with block level elements, and we'll try to cover an example of all of these. Any questions about any of the tags we went over? If you never coded in HTML before, you're probably wondering, how these actually are used. So let's actually create our first web page. So this would be a great time if you want to come along. Oh, was there a question out there?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know if you can hear me right or not, but on those, excuse me, on those header tags, is it the browser that determines the size of the tag, or is that done in the CS? Like, I know the CSS like plays into this. I don't want to jump ahead of myself or not, but I'm a little confused about, like, does the browser say, hey, H1 tag will look bigger than H2 tags? Or
Gotcha. Yeah, I think part of your audio cut out, but I think that's the gist of the question. So, yeah, so that's a very important and great question to ask. So when we create HTML documents, we're just creating like a blueprint or a structure, but it is at the end of the day, the browser that determines how it wants to render your HTML document. So again, there's many browsers out there: Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Opera. I don't know what else is out there, but they get to decide how to render your HTML document. Now, for the most part, all modern browsers kind of have the same agreement of how to, how to render an H1 versus an H2. And yeah, so an H1 is going to be larger than an H2, but again, that is your browser's decision to make. So, for example, let's say there's some weird, third-party browser out there. They can take an H1 and render it maybe completely different than how you might see it in Firefox. The same document fed to, let's say my Encore browser versus the Firefox browser. I might decide that, links will be, instead of underlining, I'll strike through or whatever. Your browser at the end of the day has a default way to render all of these tags. Was there another question out there?
So
sorry.
I was gonna say, just to clarify, you can change those H1, H2 sizes, but from my experience, the biggest reason for that, for the H1 tags, is for the bots. It's probably past what we're going to learn or what we're doing now, for sure, or at least today. But there's like scan bots, and it's like a way that like Google bots can know what's on your page because they can't see like we see. So if it sees an H1, it knows that it's like a main header. But then we can actually customize those sizes to be more appropriate for our use case for the specific site.
Yep. As John mentioned, I think Mike mentioned also, we will have control over how we want to display these things, or, change the properties, change the color, the size. But by default, like, let's say we're not using CSS. So that's what John and Mike are referring to. Just purely focused on HTML. Again, your browser has a default way to kind of render each of these tags. And as I mentioned, most browsers kind of agree, like, when they see an HR, they'll put a line across the page because that's what HR should do. But again, that is not always guaranteed. And with web development, part of the frustration can be, certain browsers, let's say Firefox versus Chrome, they might do things a little differently for a specific tag, or the way it interacts with JavaScript. Again, there might be subtle differences. So when you're developing a professional web application, you actually need to make sure that you're compatible with every major browser out there. Certain browsers might not have full functionality. They might do things differently, and you just got to be aware of it.
Unger, I was to ask you, is that the reason you're saying that different browsers work differently with the thing? Is that why sometimes some applications work better with some browsers versus others, and you'll have to use, like, in situations you have to use Chrome versus Firefox for something, or
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I'm sure we've run into occasionally where, like, this application or this web page only runs on Chrome or runs better. They might be optimized for that particular browser. Google is the developer of Chrome, so whenever Google creates apps, like, they might specifically focus on Chrome and optimize it for Chrome. So, it might work okay in Firefox, but certain browsers just, have ways that you can optimize for them specifically.
Yeah. And also just, like in the real world, when you're actually at a company, your company will determine what browsers to support. Now, if it's a more robust like company like Apple or Facebook, it's going to probably support all browsers, even going back, 10 plus years as far as like version wise. But some companies might be like, we're not even going to support Internet Explorer because who the hell uses Internet Explorer? It's probably such a small subset of market that it's not even worth spending the time to spending the time for our developers to continue to support Internet Explorer. And if that's the case, you might have, when a user that's using Internet Explorer visits your website, you can read what browser the user is using and display a specific message. I think like a standard message would be like, for the optimal experience for a web application, please upgrade to Google Chrome or something like that. And with a link to download Google Chrome, stuff like that.
Yep. So there's actually before we get to our webpage example, like let's go to, so W3 schools, great resource. Hopefully you guys have encountered already. Let's just look at the A tag, for example. Again, most browsers are in agreement. So any modern common browser is going to support all of these ones. But if you look at the documentation, usually they're going to break it down by browser. So notice here they show, Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Safari, and Opera. So I assume those are the 5 most commonly used browsers across the world. But again, they're actually specify, like, is this element actually supported by that browser? Again, in the anchor tag, all of them support it. I'm not sure offhand of like one specific one that might be not supported in Opera, for example, but supported in other browsers or Safari. But I'm sure there are examples of that. Again, they're going to break it down and make sure that, if you use a tag, you should know what browsers support it. Again, for the most part, most common tags are supported by every browser. You can kind of just accept that. But yeah, usually you'll be able to find documentation specifically telling you, what versions actually support it. So, Firefox has been around for, decades. If you have a certain older version of Firefox, they might not support the A tag or, some other more advanced tag. So sometimes you'll see a table that breaks down, like you must have version 16.6 or higher. For example, this uses functionality in Firefox. Okay, but let's actually get to our first web page, because talking about HTML and actually using HTML definitely different. So again, this is a time I would encourage you guys, if you want to code along, this would be one great time to code along and create a web page as we create it. So I'm going to go to my VS Code. I'm going to create a new file. So this file, I'm going to call it monday.html. So again, you want to have that .html prefix just so that VS Code knows what you're dealing with, and when you render it, it'll be processed as an HTML document. But again, you could, you don't have to name this with a .html. It's just, you want to have the appropriate file type here. All right, so let's go through our slides again. So these are kind of like the high level tags you're going to be using. Again, HTML is actually what starts and ends your HTML document. So to start my first web page, I'm going to have the angle bracket and do HTML, and then close it with an angle bracket. Something that VS Code does automatically is going to automatically create a closing tag for you. So I did not actually type this. All I did was close my HTML tag, and notice it automatically has a matching closing tag for my opening HTML tag. Usually I'm going to break that down to a new line. So spacing doesn't really matter in JavaScript. I know we've been working with Python where, like, new lines and tabs matter. HTML does not care about your tabbing or your white space, which is fine. But again, to be a good developer, you want to kind of format your document so it's easy to read. So I could put this, technically, all my entire HTML could be on one single line, and it'll work totally fine. My browser's not going to care as it's processing it, but that's going to make it really hard to read. So normally you're going to break tags into new lines. So again, this is my HTML elements. These are my tags, and then in between is the content. Notice I have nothing in my content right now. But again, the structure of HTML is going to be hierarchical. Basically, it's going to be nested. You're going to have like a parent, and then within that, you're going to have child elements. So in this case, my HTML document is going to have some child elements. The two most common ones are going to be the head elements and then the body elements. So I'm going to add body. Again, make sure you open with an angle bracket, type your tag name. In this case, this is body, and then close the opening tag. So the way you close it is with a matching angle bracket. And again, VS Code will be nice and friendly and automatically insert that in for you. Again, know that if you're working with like a normal text editor, you're going to have to create those closing tags and type those out. But again, VS Code kind of makes it a little easier on us developers. All right, so HTML document is this entire thing. This is my HTML elements. And then within that, I have like child elements. I have a head element and a body element. And these are nested within the HTML elements. All right, so in my head element, I'm going to do this first. I'm going to create a title element. And here I'm going to put my first HTML page. Okay, so again, title goes in your head section. Let's actually use our web page now, or actually launch it. So I'm going to bring up a browser. Let me bring up Chrome. So for Platoon, we default to Chrome. You're welcome to use Firefox. Again, just know that certain things might be a little different, like keyboard shortcuts or whatever. Let's see, how do I actually launch this? So I'm going to right click on this and go to Live Server. That should launch my page. All right. Need a new desktop here. And put that here. All right. So I have something called live server, and that's something I'm going to rep. So if you go to your extensions, search for live server. This again, you don't have to install this, but it's really convenient. So live server allows you to launch your HTML page, and it'll automatically update as you make changes. So that's what I've installed. I would highly recommend that. Again, totally optional if you don't want it. Totally cool. But basically, I right-clicked on my page. I was able to open with live server. If you don't have live server installed, you can just open this HTML page from your machine. So another way to do that would be find this file and launch it with a browser. Let me know if there's any questions about that. Definitely want to make sure if you're coding along that you're able to see your web page. I believe you can also go to the run menu and do start debugging or run without debugging. Let's try it that way, because maybe not all of you guys have live server. So we go to run, start debugging. It's going to give you an option of where you want to launch it. So I want to use Chrome. I could also launch it in Edge. I'm not sure why Firefox is not an option, but Chrome is good enough for me. So if I click Chrome, it should bring up a page for me. All right, so let's take a look at our page. Notice there's nothing here, right? But if you look at your tab, you should see that title that you gave your page. So this is how your browser takes your HTML document. It's going to look for a title, and then if it finds a title, it's going to insert that as your tab title or your header bar title. If you omit title, so let's actually get rid of title. Let's say we forgot to include this tag. Again, it's not required. Your page is still going to work without a title tag. Notice that now it defaults to the name of the file. So I have monday.html because I didn't specify a title. So this browser is going to use by default the title of my document instead of the actual title tag. But again, 99% of the time, or probably more than that, you're going to see a title tag because you don't want to see the file name. So in this case, I'll go back to my first HTML page. Any questions so far? If you're coding along, were you guys able to get your page to show a title in the tab? Let's refresh. Yep. Okay, so again, nothing too interesting. There's nothing for us to see, or no content on our page. That is because we've not put anything into our body, so that everything in your head is not actually going to be seen by the user, with the exception of the title tag. The head is more for kind of just like declaring some data or some meta tags for your HTML file. And this is something that, like, for example, Google has like a web crawler. They're going to look for some content in your head tags and kind of like look for meta tags that might describe your web page, so that if you're, if I search for donuts and my page is about donuts, my meta tag can kind of clue in those web crawlers that, hey, there's stuff about donuts on this page. I mean, the web crawler will also investigate your body tag. But again, stuff in your head is just kind of like data for your file, not anything for your user specifically. Susan, you have a question?
Yes. How is there a way to comment within an HTML file?
Yep, great question. Let's go over commenting. So commenting is supported, but the syntax is a little different than what you would see in JavaScript or Python. So to create a comment, you want to create an opening angle bracket. You want to do exclamation. So the syntax is kind of weird. And then 2 dashes. So once I did that, VS Code automatically inserted the closing part of that comment. But let's say VS Code did not do that. So I'd write my comment. Let's say today is Monday. And then to close that comment, I'll do dash dash and then a closing angle bracket. So it kind of looks like an arrow. But yeah, you can put comments in if you need to. And you will see comments. We definitely highly encourage to add in comments to kind of describe parts of your page. Again, you don't need comments. It's going to work just the same. But basically, your browser is going to see this and say, okay, I'm going to ignore this. I'm not actually going to render this in any manner. This. Right. But yeah, the majority of what you want to actually put into your web page is going to be in the body section. So again, you want an opening body tag and a closing body tag, and in between there, you're going to insert more elements to actually show some content. So let's actually go over, some of the tags that we talked about. I'm not sure where my presentation went. Sorry, I'm some window trouble here. Okay, I seem to have lost what I was looking for. Sorry, guys, having some technical issues that I can't seem to resolve. Okay, that's back. All right, there we go. Sorry, I know where my presentation went. So we're going to be focusing on these tags because these are the main ones you're going to see. So let's create some header tags. So these are, again, usually used for the headings of our sections. So let's create an H1 and see how it's rendered. So I'm going to go here. Notice how I'm formatting my document. Again, this is optional, but normally when you nest items, you want to create a tab. So since my head and my body section or elements are within my HTML document, sorry, my HTML element, I've decided to tab them once over. So it's kind of easy to see that these two are nested within my HTML. And I don't have to. Same thing with my title. My title is tabbed compared to my head element because my title is a child of my head element. Again, if I untabbed it and I had it like this, would work totally fine. My browser does not care about my white space. But this can make it a little harder to read because now it looks like my title is kind of surrounding my head and body, but that's not actually what's going on. All right, so just get in the habit of tabbing out each nested element. So in this case, I'm going to tab within my body element, create an H1 tag, close that, and notice VS Code, thank you, creates a closing tag. Let's say, let's give this page a title. So let's just say Monday will be our title. Get an exclamation there. And now that I have that, refresh my page. Notice that I get Monday here. I'm just going to make that a little larger. But yeah, so that's how my browser chose to render my H1. We can create, an H2. So let's go through H2 just to see how our header tags are rendered. Again, H1 will be your largest, most prominent heading. So usually you don't want to have too many H1s. I would say H1 should be maybe your main title and then H2s for, sections within your page. But again, you get to control how you design your web pages. So let's do Monday, Tuesday, let's go with Wednesday. H4 will be Thursday. H5, again, each H level down is just a smaller header. They're still going to be bold, but less, smaller font size. And then we'll do H6 will be the weekend, which is odd because I feel like weekend should be the most prominent heading, but that's not what I chose to do. All right, so we create, 6 headings. Again, you go from H1 to H6. H7 does not exist, as far as I know, unless they created it recently. But H1 should be most largest. If I refresh my page, notice I get, largest is H1, then Tuesday's a little smaller, Wednesday's a little smaller, and then down here, weekend is quite tiny actually. But that is still a heading that I might want to use depending on my use case. All right, questions about the header tag?
Yes. 2 quick questions. In VS Code, is there a way to like a shortcut key to just have that tabbing enforced? So for example, let's say I'm writing some code and like my tabs aren't in order. Is there like a shortcut key I can press that just says Badoop and like does that for me?
So VS Code has a lot of features. I am not familiar offhand with any shortcut. But there might be some extensions you could install. I don't have any HTML formatter. Let's just search for something.
Yeah, my mentor put me through on a bunch of extensions, and so I guess he gave me that because mine automatically indents for like the various headers and stuff.
Gotcha. Well, yeah. So VS Code, I don't have any special extensions installed, but when I hit a new line from this title, notice it went to the correct tab spot. So VS Code kind of knows like what you want, but I'm not sure it's not going to be enforced. Again, there might be some additional extensions you can install. So I definitely encourage all of you guys to explore. There's something called HTML formatter. You can kind of read what they do. You could control the indentation. Again, there might be a lot of customization you can do. But yeah, sorry, I don't know if any like shortcuts or hotkeys that can kind of automatically format a document, but there might exist. Again, VS Code has a lot to it. So
I got you, Mike. Extension is called Beautify.
There you
Beautify. Okay, thanks. Second question, is the space on the left or the right of the word Monday, does that get rendered somehow or no? Like, let's say you right after your H1 tag,
you put some spaces. Are those spaces read by the browser?
Good question. So if I refresh this, notice that my Monday has not changed. So browsers or HTML documents handle white space a little differently. So you can't just have infinite spaces and have that rendered. So if I did Monday and had one space, it's going to honor that space. So I could do something like is today. So if I did this, it still has spaces here, right? But if I add a bunch of spaces, let's see what happens. So let's say, add like half a dozen or a dozen spaces there. Notice it's still the same. I refresh my page, no sleight of hand going on here. It's just something to be wary about. So browsers, for whatever reason, they're not going to honor multiple spaces like that. But there's still a way to do it. It's just like a different format way. You got to tell your browser that you want additional spaces here. So I think, again, the browser is going to kind of eat up some white space by default. If you did want this many spaces, you're going to have to do something called a no non-breaking space character. It's kind of like sort of equivalent to like what we do \n, right? That backslash is like an escape character. To do that, again, it's not pretty, but you can do the ampersand NBSP semicolon. Right. So again, definitely not what you expect to just insert a single space. But if I copy this a few times, so every non-breaking space, this is going to be a special character that the browser will honor. So I have, half a dozen of these. If I actually save this and refresh, I should see additional spaces. There we go. So again, some subtleties with working with HTML. Just white space is treated a little differently, but you can kind of achieve spacing with the non-breaking space character.
Yeah, those look really intuitive,
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, good questions. Definitely a new environment, or HTML. It's definitely a different syntax in certain ways. But yeah, so these are our heading tags. Again, nothing too crazy, just ways to see, have some content or some formatting automatically baked in. All right, so those are our heading tags. Let's actually add some more content. So this is where we talk about the paragraph tag. If I go back to my slides, so the paragraph tag. The majority of your text should be in paragraph tags. They don't have to be, but again, that's what the paragraph tag exists for. So I'm going to add some content. Let's say today we're going to cover HTML, CSS. Let's save that. Let's go for tomorrow. Tomorrow, we're going to get a special treat. Raphael is actually going to talk more about advanced CSS topics. And then Wednesday, if I remember the schedule, what was Wednesday? I think that's where we introduce JavaScript functionality into our HTML pages. Thursday, we talk about HTTP concepts. And Friday, I think we're doing a review. Again, don't quote me on that. I'm just doing this from memory. Okay, so we create some paragraphs. You can have multiple paragraphs. So let's actually add another paragraph to our Monday. Let's say today is October 25th. All right, so we have our header. You can have as many paragraph blocks within that. These paragraph tags are not child elements of the header tag. So all these tags I've written here are direct children of the body tag. So we're not nesting paragraphs within header tags. Notice that the header tag fully opens and closes, right? We don't have the paragraph tag nested within that, versus the body has an opening and closing tag, and within that, the content are additional elements. All right, and the tabbing here should kind of clue you into that as well. So if I save that, you should see some paragraphs. All right, there we go. So again, we have some content. Looks like I brought an L there. I had a colon instead, but yeah, so again, we have our H1, H2. Notice that actually like H6 is smaller than your default paragraph text. So I'm not sure, I barely, if ever, really use H6, but that is something that still exists for your usage. But yeah, so again, paragraph tags, nothing too exciting, just the way to display text content on web pages. Any questions about the paragraph tag? Okay, so keep in mind, paragraph tags are block level. So if you notice, I have two paragraph tags here, right? They are on two separate lines. Even though there's enough space here, there's plenty of space here for both these paragraphs to share this horizontal line right here. But just the way paragraph tags are dealt with, again, browsers get to decide, but again, pretty much every browser is going to treat it as a block level element. So this paragraph actually eating the entire horizontal space here. So even though we don't see anything here, the element is taking up that space, which is why that this paragraph is forced to a new line. All right, let's do a few more tags and we'll take a break. Let's actually get through our list here. So let's do anchor tags. So again, this is how you create links within your page. So let's create a link. So a link, an A tag is an inline element, meaning it could share space with a block level element. So in this case, we're actually going to nest. Let's nest an A tag within our paragraph tag. So I could do this several ways. Create a closing A tag. So now this is an anchor element that actually is embedded within my paragraph element. All right. Notice I'm kind of breaking my convention here where I'm kind of doing this on the same line. The reason I'm doing this on the same line is because this is actually an inline element. So it makes sense to me kind of have that on the same line. I don't have to. Again, the white spacing doesn't really matter. So I could, put that on a new line and maybe do it like that. And that makes it hard to read this line. So I prefer not to do it this way. But again, you're a designer, so you can kind of figure out what makes sense to you. But also there are naming and styling conventions for HTML documents, just like there are for JavaScript documents and Python documents. So I think typically you'll always see anchor tags kind of just on the same line of whatever textual content they're within. So if I do it this way, this is just my paragraph text, but this should be converted to a link. So if I save this, refresh, notice I get not what I wanted. Oh, because I'm missing my href. So I need something to link to. Even if I link to nothing, now that should convert it to a link. So I refresh now, there we go. So notice now I get this, underline, this hyperlink that we normally see. It's usually blue or purple if you clicked on it before. So I can click on it, but it's not actually going to do anything, right? It has some functionality where I could click, it highlights it, but it's not going anywhere. The reason is because we've not given a destination. So href is an attribute for the anchor tag. And this is where you specify where you actually want to go to. So let's say, I want to go, this doesn't make sense for this link, but cnn.com. I put in http://www.cnn.com. And then when the user clicks on this part of the web page, they should be taken to this address. All right, so let's see if I've coded this up correctly. I think the URL is correct. Let's refresh our page. Now, when I click on this, if you look at the very bottom, I don't think it's probably very visible, but notice that I see HTTP/CS down here. So look in my bottom left corner. Notice when I hover over it, now it knows where this link's going to go. So if I actually click on it, I'm going to control click, open link in new tab. That should take me to cnn.com if things are working correctly. There we go. So we're taking the CNN webpage. Looks like Facebook is getting into more trouble. That's not really surprising, but yeah. So that's how you create a link. So again, each tag has its own attributes. So again, there's no magic way of knowing how do I know to use href here. That's just memorizing that href is an attribute on the A tag. Href does not really exist for header tags. So I could put an href here and say blah. That's not going to mean anything for this tag because the h1 tag doesn't know what to do with href. That is not an attribute that h1 cares about or knows about. Again, how do I know all about this? Again, it's reading documentation. So I actually go to the A tag, which I guess I have pulled up here. These are some attributes I can use. I can use href, which is going to be a URL value. Again, it tells me what that's going to do. I could also have, rel. There's an alt, or that's for images. But again, different tags for whatever you might want to do. All right, so it's all about reading documentation. Again, not the most glamorous or fun thing to do, but important to get in the habit of looking up tags, understanding what they do, how to interact with them, what attributes they might have, and that's going to be part of the struggle of learning HTML. Okay, cool. So we created our A tag. Let's actually take a break here. I think we've been going strong. So after the break, we're going to cover images, lists, spacing, and sections, and kind of see how those are rendered on our webpage. But let's take a 8-minute break. So please be back at